In a recent installment, we saw how ancient works of the imagination looked to the distant unknown past and to distant unknown places as the settings for their stories, and that they tended to see the primordial world as far better than the one that they themselves knew. So where do the creators of the post-classical world, i.e. the Middle Ages, turn when they wanted to suspend their disbelief? Like their predecessors, they too turned to the distant past, and in particular to the Trojan War, which was now even more legendary than it had been before. But they also set their stories in times which were somewhat more recent, though still distant enough to leave room for their unfettered imaginations. These stories began with the poems sung by traveling musicians called troubadours. They revolved around the twin themes of battle and love, and their protagonists were chivalrous knights. And just as the songs of the troubadours were meant to stimulate the imagination of their listeners, the written versions of these stories often included the kind of colorful illustrations which are now associated with children's books and graphic novels. One of our earliest medieval fantasies is the epic poem Beowulf. Though it was composed in England sometime before or during the 10th century CE, it seems to have been set in Scandinavia during the 5th and 6th centuries, among the peoples who were the ancestors of the medieval Anglo-Saxons. But even though it refers to people and places which we know to have existed at the time of the story itself is full of heroes, monsters, and battles, as Beowulf fights both the dragon Grendel and Grendel's equally monstrous mother. The poem seems to have been developing in spoken form for a long time before finally being written down, since it includes both pagan and Christian elements and alludes to several of the stories in the book of Genesis. It also contains many secondary stories, which suggests that, like the epics now attributed to Homer, it grew out of a collection of individual tales about different heroes, out of whom it chose to focus on Beowulf while pushing the others to the background. We only know about Beowulf from a single manuscript, but much deeper traces have been left in European literary culture by the genre known as Romance. These were long poems from the later Middle Ages, the 12th and 13th centuries, which featured both heroic exploits and the pure love between a knight and the lady he loves but must fight for, whether against other knights or fearsome creatures like dragons. But these poems aren't called romances because they focus on love. Instead, what we now call romance comes from these stories, which were written in the vernacular language of medieval Europe, which was called Romance, i.e. Roman, to distinguish it from the Latin of the Church. The most popular romance of the Middle Ages was the Roman de la Rose, which was a long allegorical poem with characters like friend and nature, which examined the nature of love through the story of a man's attempts to woo the woman he loves. Many of these medieval romances were grouped together into three large cycles of songs known as the Matter of Rome, the Matter of Britain, and the Matter of France. These were the names given in the 13th century to various poems that had been composed over the previous 100 years or so, and had by then been sorted into three groups according to whether their subject matter was set in the classical world, i.e. in Troy or in Rome, in the pro-England of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, or in the kingdom of Charlemagne, which was, properly speaking, the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore Frankish, i.e. Germanic, rather than French. But none of these songs, no matter when they were set, made any attempt to reflect that setting realistically, in the way Shakespeare, say, tried to do in his history plays. The Song of Roland, for example, turned a small battle between Frankish soldiers and a Basque army in the year 778 into a monumental contest between Christians and Muslims, hundreds of years before the Crusades, which were taking place when the poem was actually composed. In the same way, even the stories set in Troy and Rome describe the kind of virtuous and brave knights that we find in the Arthur stories, and their battles are two-man combat of the sort that have been the stuff of war stories ever since Homer's Iliad. It was the Iliad which influenced the decision to set some of the medieval romances in Troy. Though medieval Europeans couldn't read Greek and didn't have copies of Homer's work, they knew about Troy from a short version of the story in Latin and a couple of prose accounts of the Trojan War. Though these accounts, which were very popular during the Middle Ages, were composed at some point during the later Roman Empire, they claimed not only to be more reliable than Homer was about the events of the war itself, but to be more ancient than the Iliad. They were supposedly written by two of its characters. This suggests that the medieval readers who preserved these works and the medieval writers who based their own works on them didn't think of them as purely imaginative, and that they themselves were writing, if not works of history, then what we would call at least historical fiction, because it was set against what was believed to be a background of fact. Given this background, it's not surprising that one of the most popular parts of the medieval story cycle was never part of the ancient epic itself. This was the romance between the Trojan prince Troilus and the young woman Cressida, which was first told in the mid-12th century epic poem known as Le Roman de Troie. Though Troilus falls in love with her and she with him, in the end she abandons him for a Greek warrior whom she meets when Troy loses the war. While Troilus appears in the Iliad, Cressida is a medieval invention, and like some other medieval romances, the story was adapted for other literary genres, in this case, a poem by Geoffrey Chaucer and a Shakespeare play. Two other heroes of the matter of Rome were the Macedonian general Alexander the Great, who appeared in medieval versions of the Alexander romance, which was so popular in late antiquity, and Julius Caesar, the Roman general and politician. But though both of them were actual historical figures, they were made into completely fictional characters who had fantastic adventures. Alexander conquers the Amazons, searches for the fountain of life, and travels to the sun and the moon. The last set of stories, The Matter of Britain, focuses on Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Its two main themes are the friendships and conflicts between the knights themselves and their quest for the Holy Grail, the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper. The stories, which are sometimes thought to have been set in the 5th or 6th century, after Roman rule had ended in Western Europe, drew some of their material from written chronicles of early British history, though these were not histories in the conventional sense. There were legendary accounts, which looked, for example, to connect the British royal line to the Trojans who had fled the city's destruction, just as the founders of Rome supposedly had been. The characters of the Camelot stories, like the characters of the Song of Roland, are tragic. The focus is on the knight's struggle to remain pure and pious in the face of their desires and failings. Lancelot falls in love with Arthur's wife Guinevere, and in the course of saving her from being burned at the stake, he kills the brothers of his friend Gawain, one of Camelot's greatest warriors. He then kills Gawain himself when he seeks revenge for his brothers' deaths. Sir Gawain is also the hero of another poem known only from a single manuscript, in which he is challenged by the Green Knight, a man who is entirely green, wears only green, and rides a green horse. The knight puts Gawain through a series of tests of his honesty and virtue while he stays at a castle with its lord, who is actually the knight in disguise, and his beautiful wife. Though the story has the same setting as the Arthur stories, its opening lines look back to the matter of Rome. After the siege and the assault had ceased at Troy, the city been destroyed and burned to brands and ashes, the warrior who wrought there the trains of treason was tried for his treachery, the truest on earth. This was Aeneas the noble. Longobard raises homes in Lombardy, and far over the French flood, Felix Brutus establishes Britain joyfully on many broad banks. And when this Britain was founded by this great hero, bold men loving strife bred therein, and many a time they wrought destruction. More strange things have happened in this land since these days than in any other that I know, but of all the British kings that built here, Arthur was ever the most courteous, as I have heard tell. Therefore, I mean to tell of an adventure in the world, which some count strange and extraordinary, even among the wonders of Arthur. If you will listen to this lay but a little while, I will tell it forthright as I heard it told in town, as it is set down in story that cannot be changed, long written in the land in true words. Here we can see several of the ideas we've been discussing: the Roman origins of Britain and of Europe in general, an age of heroes and battle of the sort we saw Hesiod describe in ancient Greece, and a story which the author insists is true even though it retells strange and extraordinary events. We find an early version of the Arthur legends in the works of Chrétien de Troyes, a 12th century French poet who wrote about knights like Lancelot and Percival and their quest for the Holy Grail. The fact that Chrétien wrote about British legend, even though he himself was French, suggests that the content of the three matters crossed cultural boundary, and he's sometimes considered the first European novelist because his narratives are structured with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The most popular version of the Camelot legend was, however, Le Morte d'Arthur, which, despite its title, was written in English in the late 15th century by a man known as Thomas Malory. His sources were, however, mostly earlier French versions of stories about the inhabitants of Camelot, including Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, and Merlin. Le Morte d'Arthur has continued to influence retellings of these stories ever since, including the T.H. White novel The Once and Future King and the 1981 film Excalibur. Another similar, though slightly earlier, set of stories is the Welsh collection known as the Mabinogion. These too are stories about knight quests and romances, such as the story of Yvain, who loses his wife, the Lady of the Fountain, because he's too busy going on knightly quests, but he wins her back with the help of his friend, a lion. The lion doesn't speak in the way that C.S. Lewis's Aslan does, but he does help and protect Yvain like the lion in the ancient story of Androcles. In another story, the young prince Kelhoch is joined by his cousin Arthur in a search for a beautiful woman, the daughter of a giant, with whom he has fallen in love even though he's never met her. Just as medieval accounts of the past of Britain and other countries were often full of legend and imagination, even well-intentioned descriptions of foreign places could be based on nothing more than fantasy and hearsay. One of the most enduring beliefs of medieval Europe was that there was a distant but wealthy Christian land ruled by a king named Prester John. This story began to circulate in the first half of the 12th century, when Western Christians were looking for allies in their crusades against the Muslim East. And by the end of that century, a letter supposedly sent by John to the Byzantine emperor was being copied and spread throughout Europe. It makes, among others, the following claims. Our magnificence dominates the three Indias, and our land extends from farthest India to the place where the sun rises. 72 provinces serve us, of which a few are Christian, and each one of them has its own king, who are all our tributaries. In our country are born and raised elephants, dromedaries, camels, hippopotami, crocodiles, Methagalionarii, Carmathoturnus, Vincieratae, panthers, aurochs, white and red lions, white bears, white merlin, silent cicadas, griffins, tigers, llamas, hyenas, wild oxen, archers, wild men, horned men, fauns, satyrs and women of the same kind, pygmies, dog-headed men, giants whose height is 48 cubits, one-eyed men, cyclopes, and a bird which is called the phoenix, and almost all kinds of animals that are under heaven. The children in that land are raised in water, so that in order to find stones, they may live sometimes for 3 or 4 months entirely under water. Beyond the Stone River are the 10 tribes of the Jews, who, though they imagine they have kings of their own, are nevertheless our servants and tributaries to our excellency. We have many fortifications, and the strongest men and men of various form. We rule over the Amazons and even the Brahmins. Indeed, At the top of the uppermost column there is a mirror consecrated by such art that all machinations and all things which happen for and against us in the adjacent provinces subject to us are most clearly seen and known by onlookers. The amazing things described in the letter are reminiscent of the wonders recorded in older works like the Alexander Roman, which mentions, among other things, the conquest of the Amazons and a device used to view things at great distances, and the wealth of John's kingdom, including the fact that he had a scepter topped with a giant emerald, has parallels in the 1001 Nights. John's kingdom was originally thought to have been somewhere in India, which was known in Europe to have had a Christian community. Then, when contacts with the Mongol empires of Central Asia developed in the 13th century, he was placed there, and he was even identified with either the Mongol ruler Genghis Khan or his chief enemy. After the Mongol empires became more familiar to the West through diplomatic and commercial contacts, John moved farther away, where the lack of information made stories about him and his world more feasible. A popular location was Ethiopia, which was known to be a Christian country, and which Europeans like the Portuguese had begun to contact in the 14th and 15th centuries. In addition to wholly invented places like the kingdom of Prester John, there were reports written by people who had actually traveled to distant lands. The most famous European traveler of the Middle Ages is, of course, the Venetian Marco Polo, who visited Yuan dynasty China during the reign of Genghis's grandson Kublai, though other travelers, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, also wrote accounts of their travels in South and East Asia. Some of these travelers could have embellished their stories of what they had seen, or they may have been told by locals about magical creatures like dragons or places where all of the soldiers were women. They then had to decide whether to reject such stories as absurd, to accept them and write them down as fact, or to record them while casting doubt on their accuracy. Even Marco, who was sometimes critical of what he had heard from others, still wrote things like the following about the Andaman Islands. Andaman is a very large island. The people are without a king and are idolaters, and no better than wild beasts. And I assure you, all the men of this island of Andaman have heads like dogs, and teeth and eyes likewise. In fact, in the face they are all just like big mastiff dogs. They have a quantity of spices, but they are a most cruel generation, and eat everybody that they can catch, if not of their own race. They live on flesh and rice and milk, and have fruit different from any of ours. On the other hand, some travelers might not even have visited all of the places they claim to have seen. The 14th century Ibn Battuta, for example, was a North African Muslim who traveled extensively, but may not have visited China, Bulgaria, or some of the other places he describes. In fact, some of what he says about China seems to have come from Marco Polo or from previous Muslim works. One book in particular, which was one of the most popular travelogues of the Middle Ages, seems to have been entirely plagiarized from several more factual accounts of the 14th century. Even the supposed author, Sir John Mandeville, is now thought to have been a pseudonym for a French writer of the time. The book welcomes fantastic stories of all kinds, such as the traditional Jewish legend, a form of which also appears in the letter of Prester John, about the river Sambation, which flowed with stones, so that the lost 10 tribes of Israel who lived beyond it could not cross it and return home. It also includes an account of Prester John taken from the letter which was circulating at the time, and much like Marco Polo, it describes as follows the people of the Andaman Islands. There are many different kinds of people in these isles. In one, there is a race of great stature, like giants, foul and horrible to look at. They have one eye only, in the middle of their foreheads. They eat raw flesh and raw fish. In another part, there are ugly folk without heads, who have eyes in each shoulder. Their mouths are round like a horseshoe in the middle of their chest. In yet another part, there are headless men whose eyes and mouths are on their backs. And there are in another place folk with flat faces without noses or eyes, but they have two small holes instead of eyes and a flat lipless mouth. In another isle there are ugly fellows whose upper lip is so big that when they sleep in the sun, they cover all their faces with it. The book also mentions, among other wonders, a plant which turns up in several other medieval texts as well, the vegetable lamb of Tartary in Central Asia, which was a plant that produced sheep. This may have been invented to explain the production of cotton, which came from India but was mostly unfamiliar to Europeans of the time. At a time when most people did not move very far from the place where they were born, but may have heard tales of distant lands, the idea that there were unnatural or magical things beyond the borders of home was not restricted to Europe. One of the most famous Chinese stories, which is still being adapted into movies and games, is The Journey to the West, in which a Buddhist monk travels to India to find copies of the sacred writings called sutras. Though the book was originally written in the 16th century, it's broadly based on an actual monk's account of his journey some 900 years before. But in this fictionalized version, the hero is accompanied by celestial creatures like the mischievous Monkey King, and in the course of their journey, they fight demons and travel underwater. Monkey has a number of tools at his disposal, such as the ability to pull the hairs from his body to create clones of himself. There were also tales of travels which made no attempt to locate themselves in anything like a real-world setting. The Persian 1001 Nights, for example, contains several stories about a traveler named Bulukiya who encounters talking snake, angels, and an herb which makes it possible to walk on water. In his quest to find an herb that grants immortality, a motif which goes all the way back to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, Bulukiya visits many strange islands and is given descriptions of other worlds and of hell. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, there was a change in the forms of imaginative expression being used in Europe, as the romantic poems sung by troubadours gave way to printed books. At the same time, the distant past became a more concrete reality as ancient texts were rediscovered, ancient art and architecture were examined, and history became a serious discipline rather than a playground for the imagination. The mystique of foreign lands also began to dissipate as Europeans began to travel to and establish connections with parts of Africa and Asia, which made them less mysterious and therefore harder to exploit as places where the rules of the natural world did not necessarily apply. In our next lecture, we'll look at the new forms and genres that arose to supply the needs of the Western imagination. Please remember to like and subscribe.